think, perhaps most pernicious consequence is that you might create the problem you're trying to regulate away.
A critical point to this discussion about why the CMA is probably, I think, still even post the Commission booking E. Trevelli, the most feared merger control authority on the planet, at least from the vantage of Silicon Valley, is actually because there's very little recourse if the CMA gets it wrong.
So this evening we're going to be discussing the government's Digital Markets, Competition and Consumers Bill, in particular the part one of the bill focused on digital competition that is currently before Parliament. So the bill tries to achieve addressing some alleged anti-competitive practices and is seen by its proponents as a long overdue set of powers to address excessive market power amongst some of the largest technology companies on the planet. There are concerns, however, raised by the IEA and the ICLE's recent report, Digital Overload, that this comes with risks as well as potential rewards, particularly when thinking about issues like excessive discretionary power to regulators, accountability for arm's length bodies, for investment into the UK economy, for innovation, for product change. Admittedly, some of these issues, since the time we wrote our briefing on the topic, have been addressed, at least to some extent, by the government's amendments. But there's still, I think, some quite fundamental, tricky core questions to answer. So I'm looking forward to getting into a discussion with our panellists today. So each panellist is going to give an introduction of around 5 to 7 minutes. I'll time them and make sure they don't go too far over. And then we'll have the opportunity, I'll ask them some questions, and then I'll go to you, the audience, and we have a roving mic available. So our first speaker this evening is Stephen Hammond, MP, who's been serving as a Member of Parliament for Wimbledon since 2005. He served in ministerial roles in Transport and Health and Social Care Departments, and he's also a member of the Regulatory Reform Group, a new group of parliamentarians that are seeking to promote regulatory accountability and have taken a special interest in the Digital Markets Bill. Stephen.
Matthew, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to say a few words this evening. The topic of our discussion is, does the Digital Markets Bill threaten Britain's economy? I think that what I wanted to start was just reminding everybody what the title of the bill says. It says it's to provide for regulation of digital markets, provide provision about competition, and make provisions relating to the protection of the consumer. And as you rightly pointed out, proponents of the bill say we have an adapting digital market moving very quickly, and therefore we need to adapt and modify regulation to the changing market conditions to address competition and protection of the consumer. And proponents of regulation all too often say exactly the same thing, which is that regulation is necessary because this is the only way we can protect the consumer. It has very little to say about a number of other important topics that I want to mention in a moment. But implicitly, some of the time, what is also being said is that the consumer isn't capable of making logical choices and that the consumer can't protect themselves. And I think that quite often that is at the basis of regulation. And in my quote to support digital overload, what I made the point was that this is a significant increase in regulatory power without any proper accountability. And I have no doubt we're going to get into some of the minutiae of the bill in a moment. But it seems to me that actually the question and behind the question tonight is, over the last 10 years, but certainly since 2016, the increase of power of the regulators and of regulatory power without proper analysis of the benefit to wealth creation, consumer benefit, accountability, has become completely widespread. I sat on the Financial Services and Markets Bill, and actually at the core tenet of that, and of all the amendments that myself and several other backbenchers put down, was actually trying to make the regulators in financial services accountable in some way, shape or form. At its very basic, giving a report to Parliament, but actually trying to define its powers. And as John Penrose said at the report stage last week, it is not that we want to trash standards or protection of the consumer, if that is necessary. But what the government should be keen is on better, not more regulation, and to ensure that we have some analysis, which all too often isn't there, of economic benefit versus economic cost. Is it actually providing the requirements for competition properly, and is it doing so in an efficient way? And I think the other noticeable trend we see in the regulatory space at the moment is the contention, and this again was writ large during the Financial Services Markets Bill, and dare I say, I think behind the Competition and Markets Authority, is the implicit contention by some regulators when there is the challenge of accountability put to them, that actually you, the politicians, aren't really competent to do this. You don't have the resource to do this, and you're not really competent. And that it's hidden behind the argument that you are trying to interfere in our independence and our operational independence. And I do think that, at its very basic, that is a real threat to markets, to wealth creation. And particularly as Conservative politicians, we should be fighting back against that. And I think it's worth considering the bill in the basis of the first principles of regulation. When you want to introduce a new piece of regulation, surely the first thing you should ask yourself is why? Is it really needed? And what is it actually going to do? And shouldn't you challenge sometimes the accepted wisdom that is in front of you? The accepted wisdom is that although we're in a highly dynamic digital market, there are really only two great global players or three great global players, and they must restrict competition. Well, in economic theory, of course, that may well, there may well be some element of that. But if you have monopoly or monopolistic positions, it would depend on the barriers to entry, but it'll also depend on the fast moving of technology. And therefore, the technology that may give you power at one moment may not give you power in the next moment. And I think that the key purpose of all regulation, and certainly in bills like this, is were we actually was there clear purpose to what we were doing? And to some element, you would say the protection of consumer, but how far should you take that? I also think certainty. It is. I was just discussing beforehand that obviously Rishi Sunak has been having today an investment summit, and we've had announcements from Microsoft in particular about investment. But investment comes from the certainty of government's positions and the certainty of regulatory. And one of those certainties comes from the scope of rights, powers and obligations that are placed on the regulator. To be clear, and surely one of the key problems with this bill, when you certainly wrote your digital overload, was that was not true. It would appear that the DMU initially had almost untrammelled powers with no real definition of how they were going to be operated. And I think the third principle, which again, this bill is still uncertain of, although is better post the report stage, is transparency. The principle should be that if you give regulator powers, not only should they be accountable, but they should be able to show their methodology in how they make decisions against any defined criteria put to them. And it is still unclear in some of the minutiae I'm sure we'll discuss later whether or not that is actually applicable at the moment in terms of the CMA powers, the DMU powers with this bill. The regulated, it should be a basic principle that the regulated should be able to see, I think, and that is also not clear. I mean, I've already touched on accountability, but surely it must be fundamental in a democracy and in a thriving capitalist free market economy that if we put in place as Parliament, if we initiate and we legislate for regulation, it must therefore be beholden upon us to make sure that those bodies are accountable to us, to a sponsoring department, or to some independent audit process. And again, we have the makings of that accountability, but I'm still not clear that it's actually they're visible and likely to operate in a satisfactory way. I'm also clear, and this is why I wanted to make these basic remarks at the beginning, is that this bill typifies quite a lot of what happens in other bills in terms of regulation. And one of the key reports of the Regulatory Reform Group is that if you look across broadly our economy, it is, and it is all too often true, that point about who is holding the regulator to account and whether they have enough powers to do so is not widely evident. I think there are a huge number of other concerns we will go into about this bill at the moment, but I think to find three more. One, it appears to be that big is always bad. It seems to be a basic tenet. It seems to be that there's little acceptance that the vibrancy of the technology and digital markets means that some of the regulation you're trying to put place in this bill could be outdated in 6 months' time. It's also clear to me that the argument sometimes that capitalism drives out competition as much as it drives it in is an argument we should challenge quite a lot. I think the government amendments made this bill considerably better last week, but I think we need a wider discussion on what is the balance of regulation and how that affects wealth creation in our economy.
Well, thank you very much for those opening remarks. Our second speaker is Dirk Oer, who's the Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics, where he oversees the Centre's work on competition and antitrust issues, not only in the UK, but also the US and Europe. And he's also come in from back and forth from Brussels today to be here with us, so we appreciate that very much. On the sideline, he's also an adjunct professor who teaches courses on law and economics, and he is the co-author of that report we've been talking about, the Digital Overload report. Dirk, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you very much for inviting me. So I guess I look at this bill very much as an outsider, as a European, sort of looking at what the UK is doing. And so I guess that's sort of where my remarks will be coming from. I want to make 2 points, basically. The first is, what do I think are the core features of the DMCC, and sort of what should we make about those features? So I think the best way to understand what the DMCC is doing relative to other competition regulations, be they competition law or say the DMA in Europe, is to understand the distinction between rules and standards. So there's long been these discussions in legal circles of, well, what's the best way to regulate? Should you just have black or white rules that are very easy to understand for firms? Or should you have standards that are much more flexible and that give plaintiffs or regulators more leeway to adapt the law to new situations? I think if you look at the DMCC, it falls very much on the standards end of the spectrum, at least as far as digital competition regulations are concerned. It gives a lot of flexibility, especially in its initial form. It gave a lot of flexibility to the CMA. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. Right? There's no reason to believe that rules or standards are inherently better. However, if you want a standards-based model to work, you need to give courts the opportunity to craft the rules on a case-by-case basis. Otherwise, you're just giving the regulator a blank check. So I think the DMCC sort of made what I think is a very reasonable choice, saying we're going to be more flexible than the DMA. We're not going to have this extremely narrow list of prohibitions. We're going to have something broader. And we'll let the CMA craft rules. That's fine. But it seems that in the process, something got lost, which is creating accountability for CMA decisions. And the place where I think the accountability is most sorely missing is when it comes to the review of decisions and the decision to submit those to judicial review rather than for merits review. I think that's really a problem when we look at a law that's in a very dynamic environment, that's that's putting forward obligations that are new and that haven't been applied previously to firms, and so we don't know exactly how they will play out. So I think that's what makes the DMCC specific. The question then is, well, what should we make of it? Is that a problem, or why is it a problem? And I think the problem comes from one simple thing, which is many of the obligations that the DMCC would be sort of mobilized to create have important trade-offs. So if we look at things like opening app stores to competition, if we look at something like creating messaging interoperability, or if we look at self-preferencing, so these are sort of what would become three sort of key pillars of enforcement, they have important trade-offs, right? Opening up an app store to competition, on the one hand, it may reduce fees for users, but on the other hand, it opens up possibilities for nefarious actors, and it could compromise data security. Much of the same can be said about messaging interoperability. I mean, on the one hand, I think many people would welcome the opportunity for WhatsApp to interoperate with iMessage. But of course, they would only agree to that to the extent that they think that their messages are safe. And that's not necessarily the case. And then if you look at something like self-preferencing, and you say, well, in tomorrow's world, when I use Google search, I won't automatically have Google Maps as the location service associated with a search engine. I'll be able to choose. That may be desirable in some respect, but on the other hand, it will mean that it's harder for, say, the search engine and the map service to interoperate, to sort of function together. It may prevent some synergies there. So if you have these trade-offs, it becomes really important to ensure that the regulator has the right incentives to achieve the appropriate balance. And again, that is going to be quite difficult, or it's less likely to happen if the regulator's decisions, if they're not subjected to a meaningful review on the back end. And I think the last point is, well, all of this would not be as much of a worry if the CMA's track record in digital markets recently had made more sort of judicious use of its discretion. So if you look at cases like the Activision-Blizzard merger, the CMA really was an outlier there. And it's only after the European Commission cleared the deal and courts in the United States sort of reached the same conclusion as the European Commission, and then sort of with Microsoft submitting a new remedy package, it's only at that point in time that the CMA finally cleared the deal, even though at the end of the day it seems to be, at least if you look at what other regulators thought about it, a relatively uncontroversial deal. So I think if you look at that track record, it doesn't, at least me, it doesn't fill me with confidence as to how the CMA will use its discretion. So yeah, I think the recent amendments go in the right direction, and that I agree.
Thank you very much. So our next introductory speaker is Verity Egerton-Doyle, who is the counsel with Linklater's London Antitrust and Foreign Investment Group. She's also co-head of the UK technology sector team at Linklater's. She has over a decade of experience in advisory, investigatory and transactional aspects of competition law in the EU and the UK, and she's also been doing quite an extensive set of deep dive into the nature of the DMCC Bill, judicial review, as well as done quite a lot of previous work on the increasing enforcement by the CMA. So, Verity, over to you.
Thanks. So exactly as you say, I'm a competition lawyer and I work with the CMA a lot. I've spent some time working at the CMA, but primarily I advise businesses, both British businesses and global businesses, on their interactions with the CMA as well as with the European Commission under merger control investigations into anti-competitive conduct and now these new kind of platform regulation regimes that we have in the EU, the Digital Markets Act, and here this forthcoming regime. So it's really that kind of experience that I want to bring to this panel this evening, and perhaps it will make me unpopular, but I actually want to start by highlighting what I think are some real strengths of the regime that this bill brings. And I think some of these have already been touched on by Dirk, but drawing on the experience of working with businesses who are trying to apply the Digital Markets Act, the kind of straitjacket of having all the rules there in the legislation, it is restrictive. Sometimes the rules don't achieve what they intend to achieve. Sometimes they achieve things they don't intend to achieve. And there's a process of working through with the Commission, exactly how you work that out. But there are upsides to having a more flexible regime. I think, there are three in particular that I wanted to highlight. The first is that this regime is intended to be participative. I think that's really important because with the best will and funding in the world, you cannot expect a regulator to be able to understand, get on the inside of technologies. The second is that it's targeted. So I think the fact that it provides for a bespoke code of conduct for each firm does mean it has the scope to actually be much more proportionate and much more targeted than the DMA. And thirdly, the kind of flexibility of being able to adapt to technology as it evolves. Under the Digital Markets Act, generative AI isn't covered because it just wasn't a thing when the text was settled. And now the Commission is kind of scrambling to try and look at AI through adjacent services like search and so on. So there are real advantages to this regime, and the reason I wanted to start with these is because they all do flow kind of directly from the architecture of the regime, which is that this is not a regime where Parliament is laying down one set of rules to regulate tech, but it's a regime where Parliament is putting its faith in what we hope will be an independent and expert regulator to make those calls. But critically, what rules are applied, to whom, how, that is entirely a matter for the DMU. So the DMU is essentially acting as, legislator, prosecutor, judge, and executioner. And I think actually administered well, the regime has scope to be world leading in all the right ways. It can be targeted and proportionate, and it can support investment in the UK. But there is this trade-off with legal certainty, which has been flagged. And I think that's a particular issue where you don't have much provision for accountability of the regulator to Parliament or to the courts. And I think we have to acknowledge that, as you've already flagged, Dirk, kind of a big elephant in the room in this debate is the stance that the CMA has taken to big tech companies over the last kind of 5 or so years, which could kind of mildly be described as aggressive. The CMA has pursued a clear agenda to intervene in the businesses of big tech companies to kind of curtail their power. And we've seen this most prominently through merge control. And the issue is that, frankly, even for those of us who spend our whole lives following the CMA's merger control practice, it has been hard over the last 5 years to predict exactly where that intervention is going to strike and where it's not. And that's under the merger regime, which sets out a much clearer legal test than what is there under this regime. So I think it's really in that context of the huge discretion that is granted that I, along with I think many others in the legal profession with experience dealing with the CMA and the Competition Appeal Tribunal, have made calls to ensure that the legislation provides for appropriate oversight of this delegation of power. And the regime is really striking in how little oversight it provides for. The amendments that went through last week, of course, take some steps in the right direction, but they don't resolve what I personally see as the key issue, which is that there remains no ability to challenge a DMU decision on the basis that the DMU has got it wrong. Now, proponents of the judicial review standard have said that this is standard for this kind of regulatory decision. I have to disagree. While it is true that many other decisions of specialist regulators are, on their face, reviewable on a judicial review basis, if you actually unpack and look at these regimes a little more closely, you can see all of them have a higher level of scrutiny than what is provided for under this bill. So sectoral regulators in the UK are subject to various different appeal regimes, and they range from what's been called Judicial Review Plus, which is a form of judicial review that does allow the court to determine if a decision is right or wrong, to kind of full de novo redetermination. But the critical thing is, in each case, the second decision maker is independent of the first. And this is the same, actually, for the CMA's other powers that it has, even under the Enterprise Act, which is subject to judicial review only, because within the administrative process, there is a fresh set of eyes in the form of the CMA panel. So businesses can expect to have kind of 2 sets of eyes on every decision, looking at whether that decision is right or wrong for all other comparable regulatory regimes, and that is not the case here. It's notably absent. But kind of leaving this argument of principle to one side, you know, one argument that you often hear is, I think you could summarise it as rough justice is better than no justice. You know, proponents of this regime argue that these issues are existential, we need to get ahead, and that allowing for a higher level of judicial scrutiny would give big tech the ability to kind of tie up the CMA in endless appeals and never have to change their behaviour. And I have to say, from my vantage and my experience on CMA matters, I just don't think this is true for a few reasons. First of all, it's not true that JR is faster than merits end to end. So in the spring, we at Linklaters did a piece of research where we analysed the timelines of previous appeals under judicial review and merits of appeals of CMA decisions, both under judicial review and under merits review. What we found was that the average end-to-end process of JR appeals was 541 days compared to only 333 days for merits. And the reason for that is that when the CMA is overturned on a judicial review standard, the court has no choice but to send it back to the CMA to have the decision made again. And that remittal process typically takes longer than the judicial process. So the argument that it's going to be faster is just not true, in my opinion. The second is this idea that there will be vexatious litigation under this regime. And I think, you know, the CMA made representations to the bill committees, which drew heavily on their experience enforcing the Competition Act. First of all, I think, you know, that is quite a poor comparison. The Competition Act is an act which provides for investigations into suspected breaches of competition law. When the CMA opens an investigation into you, the entire purpose of that investigation is to find an infringement and punish you for it. It's typically one-off, it's typically historical. That is just a world away from this regime, which is, you know, as we've said, intended to be participative, and it's not a one-shot game, it's an ongoing process. So I think just at a level of principle, the idea that big tech firms would have the incentive to tie things up indefinitely is just, I think, drawing that from CA98 is not quite right. But in any event, the bill provides that directions and orders of the DMU are not suspended pending appeal. So actually, that really, it removes the incentive for any vexatious appeals. And actually, perversely, I think under a judicial review standard, there's a higher incentive to bring an appeal that isn't going to change the ultimate decision, because if there's been a process issue, you can have the decision overturned, and then no order or direction will apply while you're in the remittal process. By contrast, under a merits appeal, actually, if there were a process error, the court could just correct that, fix the issue, and the conduct requirement will continue to apply. So I think that argument is just not good. Finally, before I conclude, I just want to say a brief word on, you know, who a change would benefit. And the narrative that more scrutiny of DMU decisions is to the sole benefit of big tech is, I think, appealing in its simplicity, and it makes a good headline. It has made a number of good headlines over recent months. But actually, the decisions that the CMA will be taking under the SMS regime will involve really difficult judgment calls and the weighing of competing interests. And in some cases, the CMA will find in favour of intervention, and in some cases, they will not. And whichever side's interests do not win out will feel aggrieved. But the JR standard makes it very difficult for third parties, for challengers who might want to get the CMA to intervene where it's not, to appeal at all. And, you know, we did another paper where we looked at cases of historical attempts to appeal CMA decisions for under-enforcement, and, you know, they always fail. It's not impossible. So in practice, that means the CMA will rightly worry about appeals from big tech firms on JR, but they won't need to worry about appeals from challengers. So I think this is a critical dynamic to bear in mind in the context of this regime, where you have no rules until the DMU makes the rules. And my strong view is that a lack of oversight of regulators is not good for the system, and it's really only good for businesses if you think the mistakes that will inevitably be made will be mistakes that fall in your favour.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Our final introductory speaker is Matt Sinclair, who's a Senior Director at the Computer and Communications Industry Association in the UK, and he's leading their new London office. He has 15 years of experience as an economist working in government as well as in consultancy for EU institutions, major media and technology companies. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you. So I just wanted to talk a little about a few issues. Firstly, about the nature of competition in digital markets and the problem if you misunderstand how that process works. Secondly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the consequences if you get that wrong. So, you know, like, what is the threat to Britain's economy? What's the nature of that? And then I'll sort of conclude a little just on the kind of structural policy issues which have been talked about so far. So if we start with the nature of competition in digital markets, I think it's really important to understand that the journey that the kind of British official perspective on this has taken. It really is only a few years ago that you had both regulators, so the Competition and Markets Authority, and ministers making clear to our partners in Europe and further abroad that we needed to be really careful about premature regulation in digital markets, that their fast-moving nature, their complexity, emphasised the risks of regulatory over-intervention or premature regulation, that it might ossify digital markets. Clearly that has changed, right? Now, why did that? And you see, that was rooted in a history, right? You can still find, if you go look on the Guardian website, the article about whether the MySpace monopoly will ever be broken, right? Like, this has clearly happened to waves of digital platforms. They have been replaced by new competitors that could differentiate in some way. But the argument essentially was, well, that used to happen, right, when these markets were immature. Then they matured and they became these kind of settled almost utilities. I think that kind of moment maybe crystallised around the Furman reports. That's this crucial official report commissioned by the Treasury, which I think everyone kind of sees as sort of the genesis point for the regulatory for DMCC. And it's important to say what's happened since Furman. Right, okay, what have we learned? Well, we've learned that it is possible to crash two of the markets that I think people would have most named as having matured, having really strong network effects, having tipped, right? Digital advertising and social media both get crashed simultaneously by TikTok, right? And at the same time in the digital advertising market, you get a whole wave of other entrants. Amazon is able to build this enormous advertising business. And indeed, one of the key charts in the Furman review, which shows the rising market share of the top two players, I think those trends started to reverse almost the minute the Furman review published, right? Which is not to get at Furman, it's to get at, I think, a simplistic view of digital markets that they are generally prone to tipping. I think you can take a pretty moderate view that digital markets, like any markets, can there be dysfunction in digital markets? Sure, but how are they distinctive, right? To the extent that we have to the point that we might have a digital markets regime, right? Because we sometimes talk about DMCC as if the whole question here is, do we like this as a competition regime? But of course, what we're doing is we're saying we need this competition regime specifically for digital markets. We don't think this is the right answer for the rest of the economy. We just think this is the right answer for one part of the economy. And I think what we've seen in recent years with the rise of TikTok, the rise of Amazon's ad business, with a whole load of other new entrants. The next wave is going to be, Disney is going to now build a digital advertising business in order to complement its video on demand service. There'll be plenty more coming. And so I think what's distinctive about these markets is their dynamism, is that ability for people to build new networks. And I think if we reflect on that, I think it leads us naturally on to, okay, what are the consequences to getting it wrong? Because I think the first consequence to getting digital markets policy wrong, and I won't repeat what the other speakers have said about some of the ways I think the bill unamended gets it wrong, and thankfully the amendments, I think, a pretty modest step in a right direction on this. But get it wrong, and I think the first obvious consequence is you'll get less of the new innovative digital services that people love and value, right? The people like these services, and these services get better at an enormous rate. And to speak to the wider regulatory, to the extent we've made building lots of other new things difficult, making new digital services difficult as well, will have real economic consequences. People value these services, and they wouldn't want to even get better at a slower rate. They wouldn't want to lose that value. Now, of course, secondly would be investment. Now, the link to investment obviously isn't direct. Right? I think we can be open about that, right? Like you're not regulated by DMC based on whether you invest in the UK. Just the same as Microsoft or Activision owning a game studio in Birmingham doesn't affect whether they are subject to merger regulation. But I think we do need to be realistic that if the UK becomes a less attractive and over time a less sophisticated consumer digital market, this will no longer be the natural place to build those services, right? If this becomes a riskier and riskier market to do business, we should not expect that we have some God-given right that these services will get built here. And that, there is enormous investment in building them here, whether it's, cutting-edge AI, whether it's all kinds of commercial services offered in Britain and globally. They're built here by British businesses and by global companies that have invested here. But I think the third, and I think perhaps most pernicious consequence, is that you might create the problem you're trying to regulate away. And I think this is the really critical one from an IEA perspective, is that if you make it harder to build new digital networks, because you're concerned if you build a digital network, you'll get clubbed over the head if it's successful, or if just because you've made the process more complicated. Now, if you want to build a new digital service, you've got to negotiate it with the CMA. You can't just go ahead, right? And all of those, these are any business, right? Is at some level a bureaucracy, right? And if you empower all of the people who want to stop new services by having this big regulatory sword of Damocles out there, that will have consequences. That will have costs. And if Britain, if it's then harder to build new digital networks, then all of a sudden you've got this greater risk that you have a real market power problem on your hands, because no longer if one digital platform sort of starts to lose its edge, do other digital platforms come in to take their lunch? And I think that's where some of the specific measures become really concerning, because if you start to come in and specifically attack the ability to say, well, I'm strong in market X, and I can use some of those strengths to build a really exciting service in market Y, which is a classic thing that CMA has been signalled in DMCC is going to be attacked, because that's seen as leveraging market power. What you're actually doing is killing the basis that's been used to build new digital services. Right? A lot of the examples I mentioned earlier, like Amazon's ad business, for example, is very clearly starting from Amazon's e-commerce business. It's not something that Amazon just creates from scratch. And losing the ability to do that, losing that ability to extend into other markets will have real consequences to ossifying that market. But also differentiation. Interoperability, almost by its nature, requires standardization. Hayek was warning about this in the 40s, right? This risk that in trying to achieve perfect competition, where every business is identical and they compete on this perfect level playing field, what you actually do is you kill their ability to build a service that's new and different and exciting. And if you do that, it's harder to come in and challenge an incumbent. And I think the risk, and I think this is so immediate risk. We lose consumer services that we value. We lose investment in building those consumer services, which drives economic performance. The real long-term risk, we undermine the dynamism of digital markets, and we get this escalating process of regulating to deal with the problems created by the regulatory threat posed by an excessive competition framework without sufficient checks and balances. So I think it's really important that, I think we've mentioned the judicial review standard a few times. The other one I would add here is around ensuring that the bill is laser focused on consumer benefits and ensuring that there is a real, and I think, again, this is an area that a number of conservative backbenchers have looked at, like Robert Buckland and yourself, like this area around how do we make sure that the CMA is required to have this thing do work for consumers and doesn't drift into helping one business interest after another.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. I'm just going to do a few questions that I think have come up from this discussion, and we'll go to the audience in a minute. Stephen, I'm just starting with you on this. I suppose this tension at the heart of the bill, that we got some kind of positive acknowledgement that the bill is designed to give the CMA a lot of flexibility, which could in theory be used well. But also it seems at the same time that potentially the CMA also has the power to make decisions in the context of competing interests, competing values, be it, do you value privacy or do you want to make sure messaging services are interoperable? Is there a trade-off between two different companies potentially that are making a claim for some purpose? It seems to me there is a bit of a tendency to give a lot of power to regulators by Parliament across a whole range of different fields. I'm wondering how do you see that kind of issue be, that kind of like tension, and maybe how do you impose the kind of parliamentary accountability when there are kind of trade-offs that should be made, perhaps not by a regulator, but by a legislator?
I think Dirk made the point that you can go for a rules system or a standard system, or we used to call it principles-based system in financial markets. There are benefits and pros to other, but I mean, my point is that although this bill is going, as it's been pointed out, clearly down the standards line, that doesn't mean necessarily you negate away from the principles, and you don't necessarily have to say we're going to run every rule, but to give businesses certainty, to ensure there's accountability and transparency, there has to be, inside that flexibility, a certain amount of specification. And I think the concern is, and then of course there's a judgment about where the level of specification is. I make the point clearly also that one of the ways that makes a standard system potentially work even better is the accountability to Parliament. And it can be as basic. I mean, one of the issues I think that we aren't confronting at the moment is we have a select committee system which looks at departments. There is a very good case potentially for looking at whether that select committee system, because of the way economies inevitably have developed, that a lot of the reality is covered by more than one department, and therefore having some cross-departmental select committees is one way. I mean, there is at the basics the necessity for a regulator potentially to produce a report to Parliament once a year. That which, in a huge number of areas, there is no requirement on the regulator to do that at the moment. I mean, a lot of them have clearly, if it's a departmental regulator, say like Ofwat, then there's a very clear, select committee. But I think it is clear, and one of the challenges I think at the moment is how Parliament puts more accountability of the regulators in, from the basic to the more extensive. And I think one of the things we've argued in the regulatory reform group is because that isn't there, then the focus sometimes of regulators moves away from consumer benefit rather into other interests.
Dirk, following up on some of your comments and thoughts, I suppose more from the international context, I wonder if you can give us maybe some key points of comparison between what you think the UK is doing in this compared to maybe the EU, the US, and we were talking before we started about how there's all sorts of different regimes popping up all over the world at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think maybe the place to look at maybe is the United States. So if we want to talk about a flexible regime, the antitrust laws in the United States are that. They were passed in the late 19th century, sort of going after their sort of big tech of the time, and they gave there wasn't yet an FTC, but they gave plaintiffs sort of a very broad slate to bring cases. And it took the best part of a century to sort of flesh out what those rules would mean. For courts to discover the consumer welfare standard, to understand that if you create these flexible rules without a proper way to then analyze cases and without a proper standard under which to analyze them, regulators or plaintiffs would go too far. And I think that the DMCC probably hasn't quite internalized that lesson, that it's very hard to, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a really important role of courts to sort of flesh out these flexible standards. And I would add that under the DMCC, you don't have just one standard. It's not sort of consumer welfare or reasonableness like in the United States. You have contestability, fairness. It's not clear sort of how what those things will mean. If I compare that to European Union, I think in a way the DMA is way more modest. It's saying, look, at the end of the day, we don't care about big standards. There's just some practices. We've come up with a list of things that we don't like and we'll prohibit them. I don't know what's better or worse. I don't know what I prefer. I think the DMCC is coming from a much better place. I think in a perfect world, you would want a regime that is closer to the DMCC's, but there need to be some fixes that enable courts to sort of bring the DMCC to where it needs to be.
So Verity, in your opening remarks, you made this interesting point about the perception of the CMA as being increasingly aggressive. And I think that does kind of create a tinge for this whole conversation, which is, okay, if the general perception of the CMA was that it wasn't on the more aggressive side, then maybe giving it more discretion wouldn't be something people questioned as much. Do you think that's potentially part of this dynamic, that there's a sense in which the CMA might have overstepped its mark a little bit, and therefore giving it all these powers at the same time is unwise, or is it, and therefore achieving more opposition from some of the potentially regulated companies who might feel like this is more of an attack on them than something that's collaborative in the way that the ideal regulatory world might be?
I mean, yes and no. So I think, first of all, for any business, frankly, but especially for, I think, big tech businesses that have been through an in-depth CMA merger review process, it's a big transition then to kind of think about moving from what really feels like a very kind of hostile and adversarial process into something that's more participative. I think there is an element of that. But I think it's actually important to kind of locate this legislation in by reference to the other things that the CMA does, and think about, in terms of levels of scrutiny and levels of oversight, you can have kind of scrutiny on the way in, parliamentary oversight of what's in the rules, reporting to Parliament and so on. You can also have kind of on the way out reporting, and also through the appeals mechanism. And I guess in terms of thinking about what is appropriate for different regimes, I think it's important to acknowledge that actually under the strategic market status regime, the CMA will be making a lot more calls that are really inherently political decisions. I think, as was mentioned, there are clear trade-offs in each of these, in each of the rules that they'll be imposing. And I think it may be appropriate there. The CMA guards its independence very fiercely, but I think for a regime that does have a much more kind of political and almost redistributive element, because a lot of it is about taking power away from big tech and giving it to challengers, I think it may be appropriate for there to be a higher level of parliamentary oversight than there is for the competition law, where the CMA has a legal standard which it is applying, and there should, at least in theory, although if you live these processes, there are always a multiplicity of opinions, but at least in theory there should be kind of a right and a wrong answer to does this merger result in a substantial lessening of competition? Is this conduct an abuse of dominance? There should be a yes or no answer to that. There should be a truth, and you should be able to try and get at it. It's often very difficult. I don't know there is such a clear yes or no answer here to the questions that the CMA is going to have to deal with under the digital markets regime, and I think that just weighs in favour of more scrutiny, regardless of how the CMA has behaved in the past, and the kind of recent approach of the CMA. But certainly, the whole reason why we're here and we're with this bill in the first place is we're kind of living through this age of remorse where competition authorities, and it's interesting that this bill has really come up out of, if you look at the text of the Digital Task Force advice, the CMA's Digital Task Force, it's basically the bill. And I think, all competition regulators around the world are living through this kind of age of remorse where they are feeling bad that they didn't kind of fix the problems of the past, and that is colouring a lot of what we have today, and I think it's seeing some things go too far the other direction.
Matt, if I can bring you back in, so you gave the case as the firm to review, a lot of arguing that some of the analysis has already proven out of date, but I think the advocates for the bill, in particular the challenger companies that have tried to push this quite hard, would say, okay, well, that might be the case in the advertising market to some extent, but look at all this other list of uncompetitive, anti-competitive activity they're doing. For example, the App Store being a classic here, where Apple will take 30% of as a tariff if you want to sell a product on the App Store, or something around 30%, and that is conduct that's unfair. And they'll go through and indeed our key advocates for the bill to MPs and ministers, saying with a list of activity that they think is wrong and bad, and that consumers could be benefited, and certainly their competitive position could be benefited by taking down some of the tech companies and making them behave more fairly.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to say, I don't think the case should be that there can never be dysfunction in digital markets, right? I think that the question should be what is your regulatory goal, right? Is your regulatory goal, we need to step in with sort of as much ambition as we can, as fast as we can? Because I think I think a lot of people would like a regulatory regime that moves faster, but you need to kind of distinguish between two kinds of fast, right? One is, I'm going to be genuinely fleet of foot, and I'm going to kind of run through this sort of in an agile way through this forest, and the other way is I'm just going to run at this forest, and every so often I'll hit a tree, right? And I think that, so if this bill had been supposed, imagine the world where this bill is, we're going to create the DMU, we're going to fund it, and we're going to give it the kind of new analytical tools it needs, because it is addressing new and more complex markets, multi-sided markets, which are really quite different to some of the areas it's had to address before. I just don't think there's a lot of controversy, and I think a lot of tech is great. It can be a problem for them engaging with regulators that understandably struggle to address their markets. But I think instead, if you're saying, okay, the way we're going to get to speed is by reducing the extent to which incorrect decisions can be appealed, or by reducing the analysis required on consumer benefits, I think then you're in, like, let's run through the woods and hit the trees every so often world. And I think that so in terms of sort of the specific market practice you're looking at, I think we need to remember that that multiple models exist in these digital platform markets. So if you look at app stores are a great example, right? There are multiple answers out there. Some have a tighter integration between the device and the app store. Some have a looser integration between the device and the app store. And there is a really important process of market discovery about which of those is best. And there are reasons for consumers to prefer one or the other. Now, you might need to, for competition policy reasons, step in and say, there is a right answer, right? Like, you may get to that point, but you should be doing that as warily as possible, because you're removing, and this may happen. We don't know if this. Obviously, we don't know if anything will happen to the DMCC. It's the nature of the bill, right? Like, it will depend on what the CMA does. But certainly, that's something that's been done by elsewhere, is to insist you shall not integrate your app store and your phone. But like, consumers have chosen that with both options in front of them, right? And there are upsides and downsides, and I think taking away consumers' ability to choose, and therefore taking away that process of market discovery, we have to, I think, just respect the costs that's going to impose in terms of both dynamic competition, but also just actually getting to the right answer, some of the technical and other trade-offs that Doug mentioned.
Did you want to quickly add something?
Yeah, I think those two approaches.
We'll come to questions from the audience in a second. So
that you mentioned, it's interesting because I think the issue is you see both from the CMA. So the CMA's initial report on its AI, on its foundational models review is actually very much what we want to do is guide markets in the right direction. We don't want to intervene unless it's necessary. We have humility about these being nascent markets that we don't fully understand. And then on the other hand, in some of the kind of merger enforcement, you kind of see the absolute other end. And I think that's where the uncertainty comes for the businesses, and where it becomes difficult to predict and therefore difficult to kind of plan investments and so on, because which CMA are you going to get? And I think when you're giving so much power, you need a bit more direction and oversight.
Okay, let's come to questions from the audience. I think we're kind of limited on time, but I'm going to try to take 3 questions at a time, and then we'll come back to the panel. So this question at the front here. And if you say your name and any affiliation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Matthew. My name's Shane Frith. I'm the founder of a tech startup called Wona. And listening to this, I want to ask the panel about the question that's posed in the title here: does the Digital Markets Bill threaten Britain's economy? Because listening to some of what's been said today and combine that with the recent online harms bill, it doesn't reinforce my, hey, set up your company in the UK versus set it up elsewhere, particularly the US. And I think we've got to ask the question, why is there no major tech company like Facebook and Google and so forth that set up in Europe? They've all set up in the United States, and just based on probability, there should have been something over on this side of the Atlantic, and it just hasn't happened. And it's a cultural thing. And look, as a small startup, we don't go live until next month. I'm sure we're not going to be subject to the regulators next week. But my investors do look at this, because we compare it with we look at people raising money in the States and they seem to have a far easier time than we do here. And it's because investors invest in a company like mine. There's a good chance I'll fall flat on my face next month and it won't work. They invest because they want to know that if we're successful, we can be huge. And the message tends to be here in the UK and in the EU that there's a ceiling you're going to get to before they're going to turn around and say, well, look, you're dominating the market. Because, quite frankly, I want to dominate the market. And everything I'm hearing here says move to the States.
I'll take another question. Just the gentleman behind you.
Good evening, it's Fred de Fossard from the Legatum Institute. Verity and Stephen's points about accountability and parliamentary oversight got me thinking about what might happen and what the panel might think happen in the House of Lords when the bill gets there from next week. Usually, the House of Lords hate executive overreach. The Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee wrote repeated reports during the pandemic of government by diktat, accusing the executive of essentially using the House of Commons like an elected dictatorship. Yet when it comes to this bill, which has huge Henry VIII powers, massive flexibility and discretion for the regulator, there hasn't been much of a peep of dissent out of the House of Lords so far, and the One Select Committee even saying the JR standard has to be protected at all costs and the CMA is fully marvellous. Do you think this is what do you think is going to happen? Do you think the Lords will finally find some issues with the bill, or will it be waved through with little scrutiny, much as it did in the Commons until your intervention at report stage?
And was there a gentleman over here on the left side of the room?
Hello, Tom Smith from Girardin Partners. I'm a competition lawyer, a bit like Verity. I just wanted to ask the panel, do we really think that over-enforcement is the biggest risk here? We talked, Dirk obviously mentioned the Microsoft Activision case, which is a very good example of something that seemed very painful. But it was cleared in the end. And then we have other cases such as Broadcom VMware this year that the UK cleared. Brussels have imposed all these conduct remedies, and other regulators around the world made mischief over that too. You have a merger from Booking.com this year, cleared in London, not in Brussels again. Amazon iRobot, cleared in London, still going through phase 2 in Brussels. So I'm not sure it's that clear a story that the CMA is the aggressive person and everyone else is not. The other difference, as was rightly pointed out, the DMA in Brussels has a list of do's and don'ts, whereas in the UK, the CMA can't do anything at all unless it proves its case, goes through whatever appeals we end up with, and gets there. So, do the panel think over-enforcement is the most likely thing here, or will it actually very little enforcement happen?
Why don't we come back to the panel? Stephen, do you want to come in first maybe, and I know you have to leave relatively soon, on this point about where it's going in the House of Lords by your assessment? What is the next kind of parliamentary stage on this?
My best guess is that the House of Lords will be a lot more muted, as you say, on this particular than others. I suspect it will revolve around full merits versus JR. If you look at the arguments the Labour Party were bringing forward in their amendments, I think that is probably going to be the issue. And the issue around proportionality and when that can be used as a test would appear to be, to me, the things that are going to happen in the House of Lords in terms of their challenge back on this bill, more than anything else at the moment. It feels that way. To the gentleman, Mr. Frith, we need to keep finding ways to make sure you invest in the UK. And one of the issues, to the point, I'm not a lawyer, so nor am I an expert in the CMA, as I've proved this evening. I know much more about financial regulation than this sort of regulation. But the point I've been trying to make is that actually we must ensure that there is not only a regime that's flexible, but it's certain. So you know that. So one of the reasons you'll have your investors is at least they'll know what the structure of the regime is, which has been a problem, and we've seen that happen just recently in another area of the economy, which has caused some disruption, I think, and some major problems.
Verity?
Yeah, I mean, on that, taking that point first, I think, as I said at the top, that there's the potential for this regime to be really world-leading and in the right ways. And I think there's, with a regime like this, there will be an uncomfortable period where you don't quite know where it's going to go. And I think in that period, that's where the kind of appeals and being able to get the regulator overturned if they get it wrong is so important. I mean, my hope is if this comes to a good place that, over time, where you see, if you see the CMA behaving reasonably, you see these codes of conduct operating well and proportionately, actually it will look like a good model. But there is going to be an uncomfortable period, and that's where being able to overturn the regulator if they get it wrong is so critical. The other point, just picking up on your point, Tom, that I want to come in on is, is the CMA really such an aggressor? I think a critical point to this discussion about why the CMA is probably, I think, still, even post the Commission booking E. Trevelli, the most feared merger control authority on the planet, at least from the vantage of Silicon Valley, is actually because there's very little recourse if the CMA gets it wrong, if the CMA makes a decision you don't like. Now, the Microsoft case is kind of truly exceptional in many ways, but in general, if you look at the track record of appeals of CMA merger decisions, which are on judicial review basis, first of all, the CMA has only been overturned on irrationality once. That was in JD Sports Foot Asylum, and the case was remitted to the CMA. They went back, and the CMA made the same decision again to prohibit the merger again. I mean, the CMA's been overturned a bunch more times on other kind of more procedure. I mean, irrationality is the closest to merits that you really get in judicial review. CMA's been overturned a bunch of times on procedural decisions. What happens is it's remitted, you go back, and the CMA makes the same decision again. So you have this painful process of being prohibited twice. And so I think that reason, the lack of ability to challenge CMA merger decisions, is the reason why the CMA is the most feared authority on the planet in Silicon Valley. And I think that you have the risk of the same thing here.
Jack, I'm wondering if that comparative point again is the perception of the CMA that we've put out here accurate in your view?
So I think it was a really good question from Tom. Like, will we get over enforcement or under enforcement? And I think in a way, probably focusing on the CMA alone is probably a mistake, because I think actually Tom, the point Tom makes is well, you don't make it for the same reason, but you have to look at the question globally. And if you have the CMA blocking one deal here, Brussels blocking another deal there, I think what cumulatively is happening is we're creating an environment where tech companies are more and more becoming sort of, their comparative advantage becomes regulatory compliance on a global scale, not just being good at engineering new products. I think that's sort of the big risk. The question then on over-enforcement, under-enforcement, I don't know if we're over or under-enforcing. I think that what we want to make sure is that the rules that we pass, that we have a feedback mechanism in them to know whether we're over-enforcing or under-enforcing. I think for me, maybe this is my point of view, but I think that if I look at antitrust or competition law, what I like about that regime is I see cases, parties bring evidence, and if the evidence is compelling, the plaintiff wins the day, or if the plaintiff's evidence is compelling, they win the day. If not, they don't. That gives us a feedback mechanism. We can see cases and we see, well, the regulator loses all the time, so maybe they're being too aggressive, over-enforcing, or they win all the time, which means maybe they could actually push the boat out a bit further. I don't think that will happen very easily under the CMA, the DMCC as it's currently written. And
I just kind of come in, because I think whatever points we make about the CMA as it stands, I think a crucial question here is what impact will this bill have on the CMA, right? And I think Verity, I think, was the one who called it quasi-legislative, so I've been borrowing her language on this shamelessly, but I think if you give this body quasi-legislative power in a very direct way, right, like powers which in, say, Australia, a country not entirely dissimilar to us, were passed by a government, and to the extent the competition authority was involved, they were asked to help design the legislation that would then be passed by Parliament. And instead that power is going to be in the hands of the CMA.
This is the news publishers'
exactly, the news
media
media bargaining code, right? But there's other examples out there, right? Like things which, and because the DMA would be another example, right? Like a whole load of requirements which in the EU have been laid down as legislation and agreed via the EU's complicated process to agree such things, right? For all the advantage we might see in terms of flexibility, that power is political, right? Quasi-legislative, and it will be politicizing. And I think that whatever I think there's a lot of people who have a sort of patriotic pride in the CMA and British regulators, right? But the more you give a regulator political decisions to make, the more it will become politicised inevitably, because it will be making decisions about that affects the balance of returns between consumers and business users, between different kinds of business users. And I think that comes down to Shane, just to conclude on Shane's question, which is the thing that I think one of the things that really worries me about this bill is it will change the criteria for success, both between new and existing businesses and between existing businesses. It's going to make success more a matter of regulatory affairs. So to take newspapers as an example again, I think British newspapers have been great for a very long time by living or dying on their relationship with readers. If instead they live or die based on their relationship with the Competition and Markets Authority, I think it's just really profoundly troubling about the kind of economy you start to create. We're going to make regulatory affairs companies, and that may be inevitable in some sectors, right? If you've got a natural monopoly, that might be very hard to avoid. But doing that, to come back to my self-fulfilling prophecy point, creating that because you've impaired this process of dynamic competition, I think has real consequences. And I think we need to take that seriously, because you go down this world where whether your business succeeds or not comes down to its CMA review, its engagement with the CMA, not its ability to thrive in the market. And I think that's why we worry about this kind of regulatory power questions beyond the kind of principles of law.
So there's a few more questions in the audience, but Stephen, if you needed to leave at any time. At quarter past, probably 5 more minutes with you. Excellent. There's these 3 questions here on the...
Thank you very much. My question's sort of twofold. One is perhaps aimed more at the lawyers on the panel, which is, I have a deep dislike of the way the Sherman Act has operated, including the fact it was originally designed to be incredibly narrow, and the judges, perhaps relevant to the last question, ran with it and defined it incredibly narrowly. But I don't quite see how having judicial review would solve the problems of this Act, because you're creating all these different, very vague principles like fairness. Aren't you essentially just replacing assessment by a random regulator to a random regulator and a random judge? Surely you have to have a more tightly defined set of requirements for judicial review to be anything other than the COVID inquiry. We have a judge doing it. It doesn't magically make it a different process. The political one, which is perhaps for the more to the campaign room of the MP, is what explains this. There's been this huge talk about how the CMA has got massively more aggressive, how there's been a huge shift away from sort of 80s style neoliberal market system over the last few years. I thought Matt was very good at sort of describing the history of it, but where's it come from? Do you have any theories as to what's going on that explains it? There hasn't been a change of government or anything, so what explains this radical shift in the British system from being clearly more free market and less interventionist to the EU to arguably being more so?
Just next to you, yeah.
Hello there, Andrew Luliker from Europe Economics. The question I have is the following. The bill seems to be quite clearly based upon a particular and novel conception of how competition works in digital markets, the sort that Matt was just spelling out before. I'm gone. Oh, no, I'm back. Now, I wondered to what extent you might think that would be expected to, and have to, in principle, influence the way in which the CMA responded to the powers that it had. So to the extent that it's built in to the conception of the measure, and that Parliament sets out, it endorses a particular theory of competition, is it not likely that the CMA would feel obliged, as a consequence of that, in its implementation of its powers, to reflect the conception of competition in these markets upon which the establishment of these institutions were based?
And the gentleman next to you again.
Tom Burrows, on the group editor of Wealth Briefing. We cover private banking and sectors like that. And I suppose my interest in this topic is more towards the fintech end, because obviously there's so much crossover between technology and finance, and I'm sure that the Member of Parliament here probably would agree with me on that point. From a banking and sort of financial services point of view, the thing that occurs to me is that is there not any kind of risk of, with this what appears to be almost like a sort of precautionary principle that sort of work with how this organisation may operate, that you could also end up with another problem, which is a form of regulatory capture, and I hardly need to sort of spell that out to the IAA, who sort of wrote the book on it, almost literally on this problem. But how much of a risk is there that eventually the industry sort of almost ends up using the whatever entity is that's given all this power to sort of raise the sort of the barriers to entry and sort of create a kind of moat, as it were, around itself, which might be obviously damaging to the UK in the broader sense. So how much of a risk is there?
Stephen, do you want to come in, respond to those questions, and if you have any concluding remarks as well?
I think the political point you're raising, is fascinating. Is when did that mindset change? Between 2010 and 2016, there was the initially 1 in, 1 out regime and 1 in, 2 out regime, and to a certain extent, that did place discipline on ministers when you were bringing forward. I mean, I sat in regulatory committee. The slight worry, of course, was that you got rid of you brought in, something that affected the digital world of today, and you took out the 1890 Donkey Act. And you think I'm joking? That did happen, and several. So it wasn't working as well as it should. But the pressure on parliamentary scrutiny and accountability, without that being there, and also looking at efficiency, I think you can. Some of the pressures we're seeing now, and some of the pushback from myself and other colleagues about why Parliament needs to be more involved in accountability is coming from the fact that that regime died and was never replaced by anything, and therefore we then had regimes which have allowed greater power to regulators. We have, I think, forgotten in a number of areas the benefits of what privatisation brought, and therefore over-regulation of some of those industries, without remembering what we took into practice. Now, I know privatisation, 40 years ago, that process started, but we shouldn't forget the dynamism, the dynamic impact that had on the British economy, and we shouldn't forget, the deadening influence of the state trying to dictate how it runs businesses, and/or the state trying via competition authorities to direct which businesses succeed and which shouldn't. And that, I think, is the other point, which sort of slightly leads into the gentleman's point about fintech. If you set up levels that are too high to enter, or you take the view, and it comes back to one of the points I was making earlier, there is in the financial services world now almost no concept of caveat emptor. And one of the problems, particularly, is saying that the British public are not capable of understanding particular types of instruments or vehicles they may want to invest in, and therefore, the public can't invest in that. The consequence of that is boiler houses in Nicosia set up.
Well, suitability is a big problem. FCA loves it.
Yeah. There is a real issue about, we're straying into a different area, but there's a real issue about whether the FCA should regulate wholesale and retail markets and the different competencies that requires and the different impact. And that's a continuingly live debate.
Stephen, we better let you go, but I also want to give everyone else an opportunity to turn
Apologies.
to these questions. No, that's okay. You've got parliamentary duties call, so we very much appreciate you taking the time out to be with us. Dirk, if we can come to you on this question, you mentioned really and highlight quite a lot this judicial review question, but does that go far enough in terms of addressing underlying issues? If the core principles in which the regulator is making its decisions and they're trying to make these trade-offs that have, as you've said, distributional or ethical trade-offs, is it any better that going to a single judge as opposed to going to a set of regulators? What does it matter?
Yeah, I mean, there's no guarantee that even that would work. So I think the Sherman Act point is good, where when the Sherman Act was passed, people didn't understand consumer welfare like we understand it today. We didn't have modern microeconomics. So that sort of arrived afterwards, and I think it's fair to say there's an element of ex post rationalization that then occurred to sort of reinterpret what the Sherman Act meant. Would that happen with things like, or will that happen with terms like fairness, contestability, where we don't really know what those mean? Can that happen in the future? I think it's at least a possibility. The question will be, well, what are going to, if that's going to happen, we'll need some sort of guiding principles of what we want to maximize. And I think even if the Sherman Act didn't understand consumer welfare, there was an understanding of we want more competition and lower prices for consumers, or some variation thereof. I'm not sure we're quite there yet with digital markets. I'm not sure we understand exactly what we want to maximize. So yeah, even with some changes, I think courts would have their work cut out.
Matt,
I'm just going to say, just to start with that kind of governance kind of apologies, I'll answer the lawyer question, and then I'll answer the question I was supposed to answer. But I think it's just worth bearing in. Competition authorities, as it stands now, have an absolutely enormous potential scope, right? Like, that is not going to be kind of created with this bill. Like, indeed, I think it's not obvious to me there's a lot of things that the CMA can do with this kind of legislation, which in theory, in principle, after a market study, it couldn't do now, right? Like, so competition authorities have always, and even to the extent this does expand those, have always been entrusted with enormous power. That's why they tend to have a lot of process around that power to limit how it's used, and also why every effort is made to ensure that power is exercised in the interests of the general consumer interest and not parochial business interests. And so that's why I do think we shouldn't just focus on judicial review versus merits review. I think the evidence framework and how consumer benefits are integrated into that, I think, is the other crucial part of the story here. While in principles, everything the CMA does should be out there to serve consumers, having it properly baked into the framework matters, ensuring that when people appeal, that they can at every stage point to, for example, countervailing benefits, which might justify a particular market practice. At the moment, that can only be done by this. There was this risk that it can only be done by this slightly wonky. You must intentionally break your conduct requirements, and then you will later come back and appeal to countervailing benefits and hope that the court buys that, which was just an obviously impossible thing for any risk-averse corporation to do. I think having that, sort of improving things around there are really important for exactly the reason you're talking about. That just having a better review standard on a fundamentally broken process wouldn't get us there. In terms of why it's happened, I think there's really two reasons. One is, I think, to some extent, politics understandably lags the market. I think that what I hope is that we don't bake a kind of problematic competition policy in before people kind of really sort of think seriously. If it didn't alter your view of how digital markets work a little, if you start from this view of hard tipping and network effects, and then TikTok happened, it kind of has to mean that you think again about how powerful that might be, or Amazon's ad business, or any other one of countless examples. I think the other reason that I think is important is that a lot of businesses are dealing with problems, actually I think more connected to an excess of competition, but just generally through transformation in digital markets. If all of a sudden, instead of consuming a certain media property, I might go play Fortnite, or I might go watch TikTok videos, or whatever it might be, that can create real problems if you've got a sort of established media business. And those problems might have real social, democratic even concerns, consequences. But that's not a problem of an absence of competition. It's in many ways a problem of too much competition, but it leads people to kind of have, I think, a bit of a kind of closest, influential people, a bit of a closest stick to hand solution. Competition policy is a weapon I can use in this circumstance. I am feeling aggrieved in terms of my market position, therefore I'm going to look for competition policy to satisfy me. And I think there's a real risk that they do that under this regime, and I think it has in part led to the reassessment that's kind of created this regime.
Verity, if we come back, bring you back in, I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on that question about is removing or going from judicial review to full merit review enough if you're still just then expecting the courts to make these distributional decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and I think that's probably one of the strongest arguments in favour of maintaining a judicial review standard, that, these decisions are kind of inherently political. But I think that there are fixes that we could put into the regime that would fix that problem. And I mean, before getting into those, I want to say, first of all, what is the probability of the CMA getting these things wrong? I think it's really high. So if you look at, first of all, there's the kind of Sherman Act point. We've got, if you take, we don't have such a long history in the UK as there is under the Sherman Act of, interpreting the Sherman Act, but we have a long history of interpreting competition law, and, a sense of how it should go, and still the authority does make errors. We don't have anything like that here, obviously. They're starting from a blank slate. But then there's additionally a timing pressure imposed on the CMA, because there's a 9-month timeline for making a designation decision. The pro-competition intervention process is only 9 months. Now, actually, the pro-competition intervention process is one where there is a legal standard in there, which has, where we have a series of case law determining it, which is, what is an adverse effect on competition. But where the CMA makes that decision otherwise, it's typically, it's after a market investigation, which runs for at least 18 months, if not 2 years, and typically follows a market study, which runs for a year. So you're thinking these decisions that would take the CMA 3 years to make, now the CMA is being asked to make them in 9 months. And so I think the probability of the CMA making actual errors, and therefore there being a need for a standard of appeal that does allow the court to say that was wrong, I think there's a high probability of that. But then, coming to your point of, is an unelected judge better than an unelected regulator? I think maybe just to conclude with 2 really practical suggestions. I mean, one is, I think there's scope for further specification within the bill itself about what it is specifically that the CMA has to prove. So the amendments that went through last week saw some improvements there, but I think there's scope to improve the wording of the bill, to be clear about what evidence the standard to which the CMA would have to have evidence in order to impose a conduct requirement or find a breach of that requirement to impose a pro-competition intervention. The second is, because these are inherently political, I think it really would. I think there really is a good sense in having whatever political oversight there will be of this bill actually formalised, so that the political oversight is not informal, kind of backroom, impossible to predict, but that there's a formal mechanism for it. So if you look at, for example, the National Security and Investment Act, that is a regime where, there is rightly a lot of discretion because it deals with national security issues, but there is a process for an annual report, and there's a process for accountability to Parliament, and there's nothing kind of formal. I mean, there was a proposal for that put forward by John Penrose, I think, but there is nothing formal in the regime at the moment. And I think actually, because these are political, it is different to the other decisions the CMA is taking, and the political oversight should be transparent rather than being hidden.
So we have just a few minutes left. I'm going to take a few final questions though. Here at the front.
Thank you. My name is Sveta Dranevska. I work with Hammond Strategies. I have a question mostly for Verity, but maybe the other speakers. On the one hand, I hear a lot of arguments that the CMA needs more time to take decisions, but also there were other arguments made that businesses in the UK, especially for investment, need legal certainty. So how do we square the circle around that? And maybe one specific question, or just follow up, because I wasn't very sure on the argument that Verity made about big tech not likely to prolong the process. Could you provide some clarification on that, please? Because I think previous examples, such as the EU DMA, they've just launched the appeal process. What is happening in the Netherlands as well, South Korea, shows that gatekeepers or SMS firms are actually trying to prolong the process through appeals.
Next, over here at the end.
Hi, Chloe McEwen from Microsoft. We've been having this conversation against the backdrop that we haven't articulated, which is Brexit has happened. And so I wondered, I'd be quite interested to hear your views on how you think the regulator that we're discussing here, the CMA, should play that role, also against the backdrop of government policy. And when we have government policy taking account of Brexit, for example, articulating we would like to be a science and tech superpower, we would like to encourage investment, and maybe taking into account the strategic steer that's recently been published, would be really interesting to hear your views on how we look at that.
And then, well, I'll take these two questions just make them both brief here at the front, and then at the back.
Thanks. Hunter DeBose from Spitfire Capital. I commend Shane's ambition for his new venture to achieve massive market dominance and wish you Godspeed in achieving that. However, I think circumstances are very different when a foreign state actor can use the market dominance of a digital provider, for example, as seems to be the case with TikTok and the Chinese government. And I'm curious if the panel can comment on what safeguards and mechanisms are in the bill right now to prevent that sort of thing.
And just at the back.
Hi, Oscar Hayward from Latham Watkins, another competition lawyer in the room. There's a bit of an asymmetry between the muscularity of the powers that the CMA will get versus other competition regulators in the world. Two specific examples: the structural divestments after a PCI and the forced experimentation powers that the CMA will get. Are these paper tiger powers that the CMA will use just in the posing mirror of public opinion? And could this cause a half-fat UK version of products and services?
Okay, we're kind of running to time, so we'll go to each panelist just to give an opportunity to answer that question, or any or many questions there, a lot of different things to pull out, or any kind of concluding remarks you'd like to make. Verity would like to.
Yeah, sure. So I'll take the one that was specifically directed at me, and let me give a really practical example of why I think there's not an incentive to bring vexatious appeals under the regime as it is. So directions and orders of the DMU will not be suspended automatically pending appeal. They'll only be suspended if the tribunal orders that they are suspended. And so what that means, if you say that the CMA has made a procedural error in the way that it's imposed a conduct requirement, for example, or say, the way that it's implemented the final offer mechanism. So say that the CMA has made a decision that, Meta should be paying publishers a certain amount pursuant to the final offer mechanism. If there was a procedural error somewhere and the final offer mechanism is one where there are many, many, many steps in the process, right? So it's quite conceivable there could be a procedural error in there somewhere. If there were a purely procedural error, but nothing else, the incentive of Meta to bring an appeal against that decision would be actually quite limited, because at the end of the appeal, because the order wouldn't be suspended while the appeal was pending, and at the end of the appeal, what you would expect the cat to do is you'd expect the cat to just fix the error to the extent that it could, if this were a merits appeal. Now, perversely, I think, under judicial review, there is more of an incentive to bring an appeal, because when you get to the end of that process at the cat, and the cat says, yes, indeed, there was a procedural error here, which was quite critical, the cat can't do anything but send that back and send that decision back to be remitted and for the process to be run again. So I think that means that perversely, there's actually more of an incentive to bring it wouldn't actually be a vexatious appeal in this case, because it would be on a process point, but bring an appeal on a point of process that doesn't change the ultimate outcome. There's more incentive to do that under judicial review than there is under an appeal standard where the court is able to correct the error. Just to give one final point, there's a case that I've been involved in, which is a pharmaceutical excessive pricing case, where the president of the CAT says in the judgment very clearly, we've identified an error that the CMA has made. Were this an appeal on judicial review, there is no doubt that the CMA's decision would be done and we would have to send it back to be remitted. But this is not an appeal on judicial review, this is an appeal on the merits, and therefore I'm the CAT. As the CAT, we have the evidence to fix this decision and we can fix it. And probably by doing that, they've saved, frankly, years more of process of having to go back to the CMA, as one of these other similar cases did. So that's why I say that the incentive to bring vexatious appeals, I don't think exists under this regime.
Matt, do you want to come in on those questions? If you'd like to do the Brexit one, we almost got to win a whole evening without speaking about Brexit.
I won't do all of that. I'd say just a couple of things on the international point, and I want to just address the question about some of the other sort of elements in the bill. So on the international point, I think there's two kind of concerns. One is, clearly there's been this imperative, which has, I think, in part driven the kind of haste for this bill, to sort of a race to define digital regulation. And I don't think that's coming from nowhere, right? Like, if a regulation is kind of proportionate, effective, defines the rules of the road, getting there first could be a source of comparative advantage, right? Here we're talking about a very different setting, right? A, we're not going to be first, right? The DMA is going to beat the UK there. And B, there's hugely potential to get it wrong. And so I do think there's a world where the right question for the UK now is not how do we win the race to just be first, but how do we get to a regime which, in its execution, other countries will look at and say, this seems proportionate and effective and worthy of emulation. Because I think the more that it looks extractive, and I think the second concern internationally is, to the extent that we've got these kind of quasi-legislative distributional decisions being made in the UK, these decisions may have international consequences, right? They may offend the EU, they may offend the US, they may offend whoever else, right? And to the extent these are being made by governments and ministers, they have an ability to balance, because, like, at times it's important to do something that upsets the EU or upsets the US. But that's a political decision. Those are trade-offs which properly belong with ministers, with Parliament. And I think there is a real concern that sort of a couple of years from now, you've got the CMA doing something which seems unreasonable internationally, and there is just not going to be a lot of cause to correct that. There just isn't going to, that structure isn't going to be there. And just quickly on sort of forced experimentation, it does worry me that the kind of accelerated processes this has been through in Parliament, and the nature of the parliamentary debate to some extent has meant that some of the issues we've talked a lot about today, unfortunately, they're important issues like the judicial review versus merits review, has kind of sucked the air out of the room on some of those issues. Because I think it should be troubling that the CMA is going to be able to step in here and say, you must change your service in order to kind of test out potential interventions or learn more about the service. And I think it's going to be very concerning for companies being regulated, because, of course, if those experiments lead to things going wrong, I think they're going to be very concerned. They're going to be the ones who take the blame. And so, yeah, absolutely, there are some details in this bill which, look, fingers crossed the Lords can have a look at as this moves forwards, which so far, unfortunately, everyone's sort of had to focus on these big ticket debates over, checks and balances, essentially, in the regime. I think you could say the same for some of the consumer law changes here, where sort of unite the sort of news media industry and the tech industry in concern some of the changes to consumer law, but they have kind of flown under the radar because of this big picture debate. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there is a need for wider scrutiny to come back to the title of the things with the economy.
Jeff?
Yeah, I just wanted to make 2 quick points on the vexations appeals idea. I think there's a little bit of a fallacy in the way sometimes this argument has been portrayed. It's been portrayed as, well, when firms appeal, it's basically going against the interests of consumers. If they push back against the regulator, it means that consumers are going to lose, because, of course, the regulator is doing what's in the best interest of consumers. I think that that's not the right way to look at the problem. Sometimes the regulator will be correct, and an appeal will could go against the interests of consumers, but the opposite could equally well be true. The regulator makes the wrong decisions, and firms ultimately appeal, and that is in the interest of consumers. The second point which Verity raises, which I think is really important, is that here appeals won't suspend the decision. So I don't think firms have much incentive to appeal, other than they think that the regulator made the wrong decision, and so they are going to push back against that. And sort of, if you agree with my first point, that could be very good for consumers. So I think, yeah, we need to be a little bit careful. And a final thing is, I don't think anyone would raise that point in other areas of law. So when I see a criminal law case, no one says, someone who's accused of a crime shouldn't be allowed to appeal because basically he's denying the victims reparation. or postponing that reparation. I don't think that's.
Just very quickly actually on, if you don't mind, apologies.
Very quickly, and then I'm getting signals from the back.
I think it's also important to say that, like, I think the Commons has been thinking about this problem, and I think Sir Robert Buckland proposed a compromise which I think could work for everyone here, which is at the start, when the CMA is making ambitious decisions in a complex market with new powers, have merits review so that the courts can scrutinise how it's using those powers and make sure that it develops its use of them properly, and then shift to judicial review down the line, to assuage those concerns that this becomes that this isn't able to be used going forward. I just think there's a compromise on the table on this point, leaving aside some of the principled arguments, which I think would have achieved what you're kind of looking at.
I think I better finish up the panel there, but it's been an excellent discussion, and thank you as well to the audience for your great questions. We'll see if that's set out, but again, thank you to Stephen, Verity, Matt, Dirk. If you have enjoyed this, please do grab a copy of our paper at the back, and we look forward to continuing the discussion over a drink in the office. Thank you.